Welcome to Quiet Mysteries Tales. Tonight, we invite you to listen to The Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. Sit back and listen. A window unbroken. A man dead at his desk, his hand still gripping the pencil. The coroner said lightning. The diary said something else entirely. His name was Robert Blake, a writer, a painter, a man who made a career out of imagining the worst things in the dark. And then, one afternoon in Providence, he stopped imagining. He went looking. Federal Hill, an abandoned church, boarded windows, no birds, no pigeons, nothing that breathes would go near it. He went in anyway. What he found inside that black steeple had been waiting since before recorded history, something that could not exist in light, something that only needed darkness, and someone foolish enough to look. He looked. This is the story of what he saw. This is The Unknown Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft, a full animated audiobook, unabridged, narrated for the British Casebook. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There are people in this world who are drawn to the dark, not because they are broken, not because something went wrong in their childhood, but because they feel, deep in their bones, that the dark holds answers that the light refuses to give. Robert Blake was one of those people. He was in his late 20s when he returned to Providence, Rhode Island, in the winter of 1934. He had grown up near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a quiet, bookish boy who spent more time in his imagination than in the streets. By the time he arrived in Providence, he had already published a handful of short stories in the kinds of magazines that most respectable people kept hidden under their beds. Stories about ancient monsters, about doorways into nothing, about the terrible things waiting in places where no one thinks to look. He was, by any ordinary measure, a man living a perfectly ordinary life. He rented the upper floor of a Georgian house just off College Street, on the crest of the great East Hill overlooking the city. It was a charming place. Small garden courtyard, old wooden floors, windows that rattled in the wind. He set up a studio in the north attic room, where the light came in clean and cold through the monitor roof. He bought a desk, some antique furniture, had his books shipped from home. He was, to all appearances, settling in for a quiet and productive winter. And for a while, that is exactly what it was. He wrote 5 short stories that first winter. Dark ones, naturally. He painted 7 canvases, alien landscapes, monstrous entities, skies with no stars that any astronomer had ever charted. His work had always occupied that strange territory between nightmare and philosophy. He was not writing to frighten people. He was writing because the things he imagined felt, to him, more real than anything he could see out his window. And then, one evening sitting at his desk in the fading light of a February afternoon, he looked out his west window and saw something across the city that he had never noticed before. It was a church, or rather, the remains of what had once been a church. It sat on the high ground of Federal Hill, 2 miles away, its great black steeple rising above the tangle of rooftops and chimney smoke, like a finger pointing at a sky it wanted nothing to do with. It was too far away to see clearly with the naked eye. But Blake had field glasses, and he used them. What he saw made him sit very still for a long time. The steeple was dark, not the natural dark of stone and shadow, something deeper, something that absorbed the last of the afternoon light instead of reflecting it. No birds roosted on its ledges, no pigeons on its gutters, no swallows in its eaves. While every other rooftop and steeple on Federal Hill was alive with the movement of wings, this one stood alone, utterly still, as if the world had decided, long ago, to simply leave it out. Blake sat at that window for the rest of the evening. He did not pick up his pen. He did not return to the canvas he had been working on. He just looked and felt, for the first time in his life, that something was looking back. Providence in the 1930s was a city of neighborhoods stacked on top of neighborhoods, each one a different world. College Hill was the world of old Yankee money, brick sidewalks, and Brown University. Downtown was commerce and noise, and Federal Hill, the long slope to the west, was something else altogether. It had been an Irish neighborhood once. Then the Italians came. By the time Robert Blake arrived in the city, Federal Hill was dense with Italian immigrants, and their children, and their children's children, small shops, restaurants, the smell of bread and garlic and candle wax, the sound of Sunday bells from a dozen Catholic churches. It was, by most accounts, a warm and close-knit place. People knew their neighbors. They looked out for one another. They kept their traditions. And among those traditions, passed from grandparents to parents to children, in low voices over kitchen tables, was an absolute, unspoken rule. You did not go near the old church on the hill. You did not look at it longer than you had to. If you passed by it on the street, you crossed to the other side and kept your eyes down. And if someone asked you about it, you shook your head and changed the subject. No one on Federal Hill needed to be told why. They simply knew. The way you know, as a child, that certain rooms, in certain houses, feel wrong the moment you step inside them. The way you know, without being told, that some silences are not peaceful. They are waiting. The church had been closed since 1877. That was nearly 60 years before Robert Blake ever put his field glasses to his eyes and found it in the smoke across the city. 60 years of locked doors and boarded windows and weeds growing up through the iron fence around its yard. 60 years during which not one person, not a vagrant, not a curious teenager, not a reporter on a slow news day, had been inside. There were stories, of course. There are always stories. The older residents of Federal Hill could tell you, if you caught them in the right mood and they trusted you enough, that the church had once been home to a group called the Starry Wisdom Sect, that they had practiced something inside those walls that no one with any sense wanted to look at too closely, that things had happened, people had gone in and not come out, and that when the sect finally fled the city in 1877, they had left something behind. Something that still lived in the dark of the windowless steeple, something that the light of day kept contained, barely. Robert Blake, sitting at his desk 2 miles away, with his field glasses and his romantic imagination, knew none of this. Not yet. Spring came to Providence the way it always does in New England, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold mornings that still smelled of winter, and afternoons that briefly, tentatively, suggested something warmer might be coming. Blake watched the season change from his west window. He watched the birds return to the city's rooftops, filling the ledges and gutters and steeples with their ordinary, living noise. And he watched the black church on Federal Hill remain exactly as it had been all winter, still, silent, unvisited by anything that breathed. By April, it had become an obsession, not a healthy one. Not the kind of obsession a man can set aside when he closes his notebook for the night. The kind that follows him into sleep. The kind that colors everything else. The food he eats, the conversations he half listens to, the pages he fills without really thinking about what he's writing. He had begun a novel that winter, a long-planned project about the survival of ancient witchcraft traditions in rural Maine. He could not make progress with it. Every time he sat down to write, his mind drifted west, back across the city, back to the steeple, back to the question he could not stop asking himself. What is in there? He asked his few local acquaintances about it. None of them had ever been to Federal Hill. None of them knew any. He tried the university library, the Providence Journal archives, the City Historical Society. He found references, brief, vague, carefully worded references, to a religious organization called the Starry Wisdom Church, which had operated on Federal Hill in the mid-19th century and been dissolved under unclear circumstances in 1877. Beyond that, nothing. The records had a way of running out, of stopping mid-sentence, as if whoever was writing them had decided that some things were better left unfinished. Late in April, Blake made a decision that a wiser man might have thought about longer. He put on his coat, tucked his notebook into his pocket, and walked west across Providence toward Federal Hill. He was going to find the church. He was going to look at it up close, and if the door happened to be unlocked, well. He was a writer. Writers needed material. Federal Hill was everything Blake had imagined, and nothing like he had expected. The streets were narrow and steep, lined with old wooden houses that leaned slightly toward each other, as if sharing a secret. The shop signs were in Italian. The women on the doorsteps watched him pass without smiling. Children playing in the alleys went quiet when he walked by. He was an outsider here, and everyone knew it immediately. He asked a shopkeeper about the great stone church. The man smiled pleasantly, shook his head, and said he didn't know what Blake was talking about. He asked a merchant on a broader street. The man's face changed in a way that Blake noticed and did not forget. A quick tightening, a flicker of something that was not confusion but its opposite. And then the man made a gesture with his right hand. A small, quick gesture, almost involuntary. The kind of thing you do without thinking when you want to ward something off. Blake kept walking. And then, turning a corner into a narrow alley that ran steeply upward between two rows of close-set houses, he saw the steeple. It rose above the rooftops to his left, black and massive, exactly as it had looked through his field glasses from across the city, but larger now, and far more real. He followed the alley upward until he came out into a small cobblestone square, and there it was, the Church of the Starry Wisdom Sect. Up close, it was extraordinary. The building sat on a raised plateau, fully 6 feet above the level of the surrounding streets, surrounded by a rusted iron fence, on top of a stone retaining wall. The yard inside the fence was wild with dead weeds, and brown grasses that the spring had not yet touched. Headstones, old ones nearly swallowed by the ground, pushed up through the growth here and there. The facade was enormous, the stone dark and stained with a century of coal smoke and weather. The Gothic windows were largely intact, their glass thick and obscured by soot, their painted designs barely visible through the grime. The massive front doors were locked. The iron gate at the top of the steps was padlocked. Blake stood in the square for a moment, feeling the weight of the place pressing down on him. He noticed that the few people in the square were watching him from a careful distance. One of them, a heavy-set woman on a stoop across the cobblestones, grabbed two small children and pulled them inside her house. A policeman stood at the north end of the square, and Blake walked over to him. He was a big Irishman, solid and apparently untroubled by the world. But when Blake asked him about the church, something changed in the man's face. He made the sign of the cross. Quietly, almost mechanically, as if it were a reflex. He told Blake that people did not talk about that building, that the Italian priests on Federal Hill had warned their congregations against it for as long as anyone could remember, that there had been a bad sect there, long ago, that had called up things from somewhere that could not be named, that a priest had driven it out, or mostly out, that the light was what kept it contained. Whatever it was, it fled from light, and without light, it would come back. Blake thanked the policeman and turned back toward the church. He should have walked away. Any reasonable person would have walked away. But Robert Blake was not, in that moment, a reasonable person. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life writing about the exact kind of evil that was rumored to live inside that building, and the pull of it, the terrible magnetic pull of it, was stronger than any warning a policeman could give him. He found the missing bars in the iron fence on the north side. He climbed the retaining wall. He dropped into the weedy yard. He circled the building until he found what he was looking for, a cellar window, unboarded and unlatched, leading down into darkness. He went in. The cellar was vast, dusty, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside, a deeper cold, a cold that felt like absence rather than weather. Old barrels, broken furniture, the rusted remains of a Victorian furnace. Dust so thick it muffled every sound. Blake rolled a barrel to the window to use as a step for his exit, then crossed the cellar toward the stone archway that led upstairs. The ground floor was a labyrinth of unlocked rooms, each one more extraordinary and more disturbing than the last. The nave of the church was cavernous, its box pews and pulpit and altar all still in place, all buried under years of accumulated dust and draped in cobwebs so thick they had become curtains, hanging between the Gothic columns like grey tapestries. The light that came through the great apsidal windows was wrong, filtered through soot-darkened glass, painted with designs that Blake found troubling in ways he could not immediately articulate. Saints with expressions that were not quite serene, patterns that seemed to shift when he looked at them from the corner of his eye. One window appeared to show nothing but a dark void, scattered with points of cold light. Not stars, exactly, but something that wanted to be mistaken for them. The cross above the altar was not a Christian cross. It was the Ankh, the ancient Egyptian symbol of life and death intertwined, heavy and dark, and hanging at a slight angle, as if something had nudged it long ago and no one had thought to straighten it. In a room behind the altar, Blake found the library, and this was where he stopped moving for a long time. The shelves ran floor to ceiling and were packed with books in various states of decay, mildewed, rotting, crumbling at the corners, but legible. He recognized the titles of some of them immediately, and the recognition hit him like cold water. These were not merely rare books. They were books that most serious scholars of the occult knew only by rumor. Books that were supposed to exist only in fragments, in private collections, in the inventories of libraries that kept their most dangerous acquisitions behind locked doors and did not advertise them to the public. The Necronomicon, in a Latin edition he had never seen, the Liber Ivonis, the Kult der Ghouls of the Comte d'Erlet, the Unaussprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, and others, titles he did not recognize at all, in languages he could not immediately identify. He also found, in the rotting desk, a small leather-bound record book filled with entries in a strange coded script, the symbols of alchemy and astronomy rearranged into an alphabet that no standard cipher would unlock. He put the book in his coat pocket. He told himself it was for research, that he would decode it, that it was the kind of material a writer of his particular interests had a professional obligation to examine. He was lying to himself, and on some level he knew it. But he climbed the stairs to the tower anyway. The spiral staircase to the tower was narrow and steep, its treads worn smooth by the passage of feet that had stopped coming 60 years ago. The cobwebs here were thicker than anywhere else in the building, not just strung between surfaces, but packed into corners, layered over every surface, as if the spiders had been working overtime for decades. Blake climbed in near total darkness, one hand on the stone wall, feeling his way upward past small windows whose glass was too thick with grime to admit any meaningful light. When he reached the tower room, he stopped in the doorway and stood very still. The room was approximately 15 feet square, faintly lit by 4 lancet windows, one on each wall, whose louver boards were mostly rotted away, admitting thin bars of fading afternoon light. In the center of the room stood a stone pillar, roughly 4 feet high, covered on every surface with hieroglyphs that Blake did not recognize from any tradition of writing he had ever studied. On top of the pillar rested a metal box, its hinged lid standing open. The box was made of a yellowish metal he could not identify, and its outer surfaces were covered with relief carvings of entities that resembled no living thing Blake had ever seen or imagined. Around the pillar, in a rough circle, stood 7 high-backed Gothic chairs, still largely intact beneath their coating of dust. Behind them, ranging around the walls, were 7 enormous plaster figures, painted black, massive, crudely humanoid, suggesting something between an Easter Island monument and something much older and much less human. In one corner, a ladder was built into the wall, leading up to a trap door in the ceiling, the steeple above. Blake crossed the room to the open metal box. Inside, suspended by a metal band and 7 supports, was a stone, roughly 4 inches across, deep red-black, almost opaque, many-faceted, polished to a high sheen. He could not tell, at first glance, whether it was a natural crystal or something that had been cut and shaped. He bent closer, and then he made the mistake that would cost him everything. He looked into it. What he saw, or what he believed he saw, in the depths of that stone was not a reflection. It was not the distorted image of the tower room or his own face. It was something else entirely. Worlds, other places, vistas of alien architecture stretching under skies with no sun, mountains on planets that no human eye had ever mapped. And deeper still, past all of that, something that was not a world at all, a darkness so total and so alive that the word darkness did not really apply to it. A darkness that knew it was being looked at, that recognized the eye at the other end of the looking. Blake pulled his gaze away from the stone with physical effort, the way you pull your hand away from a flame. His heart was hammering. The room felt different, not physically different. Same dust, same chairs, same louvered windows admitting the same thin bars of dying light. But the quality of the space had changed. There was a presence in it, not a sound, not a movement, not anything he could point to, just a certainty, absolute and cold, that he was not alone in the room. He looked down and noticed, for the first time, the mound of dust in the far corner near the ladder. He crossed to it, brushed it away with his handkerchief, and found himself looking at a skeleton, male, based on the fragments of clothing still intact. Grey suit, old-fashioned cufflinks, a stick pin, a reporter's badge from the old Providence telegram. In what remained of a leather pocketbook, Blake found several bills dated to the early 1890s, a celluloid advertising calendar for 1893, and some business cards. The name on the cards was Edwin Libridge, reporter, the Providence Telegram, missing since 1893, 42 years. The skeleton's bones were in an unusual state. Some of them had been scattered, as if disturbed by something moving through the room. Some showed strange discoloration, a yellowish stain, and in places, what looked like charring. The skull had a burned aperture in the top, as if something powerfully acidic had eaten through the solid bone from above. Then he looked at the stone again. He had not meant to. His eyes simply went there, and in the gathering dusk he saw something that made the hair rise on his arms. The stone was glowing, faintly, unmistakably, with a cold red-black light that had nothing to do with the last rays of the sun coming through the louver boards. It was generating its own light, or something behind it was. He reached out and closed the lid of the metal box over the stone. The click of the latch was very loud in the silence of the tower, and from above, from the absolute darkness of the windowless steeple beyond the trap-door, came a sound, soft, careful, the sound of something shifting its weight. Blake ran, down the spiral stairs, through the nave, through the cellar, out the window into the late afternoon air of the churchyard, down through the alleys and avenues of Federal Hill, back across the city to his own street, his own house, his own desk, where he sat for a very long time without moving, listening to his own heartbeat slow back down toward something normal. He told no one. Not the next day, not the day after that. He sat in his study with the coded record book he had taken from the church and began the slow, painstaking work of deciphering it. He read everything he could find about the history of Federal Hill, about the Starry Wisdom sect, about the church on the hill, and piece by piece, the picture assembled itself. The Starry Wisdom sect had been founded in 1844 by a man named Professor Enoch Bowen, an archaeologist recently returned from Egypt. He had purchased the old Free Will Church on Federal Hill in July of that year and begun converting it to new purposes. Within a year, the congregation numbered nearly 100. The local Baptist minister had preached against them. The newspapers had published vague, nervous items. By 1848, there were stories of disappearances in the neighborhood. By 1853, an official investigation had come to nothing. No evidence, no witnesses willing to speak, no bodies. Stories circulated about what happened inside the church, about a stone, a shining trapezahedron they called it, that the congregation used for what they described as visions, about an entity that the stone called forth, a being that lived in the absolute dark, that could not cross into light, that told the congregation things about other worlds, other times, other reaches of a universe that human beings had barely begun to map, and that demanded, in return, sacrifices. By 1877, the city's tolerance had run out. A secret committee had gone to the mayor. The sect was given an ultimatum. In April of 1877, the church closed. Before the month was out, over 180 members of the congregation had quietly left Providence. They did not say where they were going. The church was locked. The stone was left inside, in its box, on its pillar, in the tower. And that is where it had been waiting, through the administrations of 12 American presidents, through 2 world wars and a depression and the complete transformation of the world around it, waiting in the dark of the windowless steeple for someone to open the lid of the box and look inside. Robert Blake had done that. He had looked, and now, sitting at his desk in the spring of 1935, decoding the record book he had taken from the church, he began to understand what that meant. The cipher, once broken, turned out to be written in a language used by certain ancient cults, a language Blake recognized from years of research into the darkest corners of occult scholarship. The entries described the entity called up through the stone in terms that made Blake's hands go cold as he read them. It was not a ghost. It was not a demon in any theological sense that Western religion had ever tried to categorize. It was something from outside, something from beyond the boundaries of the known universe, something that had been in the stone, watching through it, moving through the visions it produced, long before any human being had ever laid eyes on it. It was old beyond reckoning, patient beyond imagining, and now, for the first time in 60 years, someone had opened the box. June came. Blake finished deciphering the record book. He wrote in his diary, with increasing frequency and increasing unease. His entries circled around a central terror that he could not quite bring himself to state directly, that the act of looking into the stone had not been a passive observation, that the connection went both ways, that whatever lived in the darkness of the steeple had looked back at him through the stone and had seen him clearly and had not forgotten. By June, the Italian residents of Federal Hill were noticing things. A story appeared in the local papers, brief, half amused, filed under the heading of Neighborhood Superstitions, about unusual noises coming from the abandoned church on the hill. Bumping sounds from the dark steeple, scraping, a sense, reported by those who lived nearest, of something restless and awake inside the building for the first time in decades. The local priests were receiving visits from parishioners who were not sleeping well, who were having dreams, who were hearing things at night that they could not account for. Blake read these items in the newspaper, and felt them like a physical blow. He had done this. He had opened the box. He had looked into the stone, and in doing so he had, in some way he did not fully understand, but could not dismiss, woken something up. He wrote in his diary about his responsibility, about the duty to go back to the church, to close the steeple, to let daylight in, and drive whatever was living there back into the darkness beyond the stone. And then, in the very next entry, he wrote about his inability to do it. Not inability in the sense of physical cowardice, something else, a pull, a current in his mind that ran not away from the church but toward it. A voice, not a literal voice, but something that functioned like one, that spoke to him in the territory between sleeping and waking and told him things about the stone, about what it showed, about the knowledge available to anyone willing to look into its depths long enough and hard enough and without flinching. He had not gone back to the church, but in a sense, part of him had never left. July 17th, 1935. A thunderstorm moved through Providence overnight and knocked out the city's electrical system for a full hour, 1 hour of darkness. For most of the city, it was an inconvenience, candles and flashlights, and waiting for the power to come back. On Federal Hill, it was something else. The newspaper account the following morning was written in a tone of gentle condescension, the kind reserved for immigrant communities who still believed in the old country's stories. But behind the details, if you were reading carefully, something genuinely extraordinary had happened. In that 1 hour of darkness, with the street lights out and the lamps in the windows gone, the thing in the steeple had come down, not metaphorically, not in someone's nightmare. The residents living nearest the old church, those whose windows faced the churchyard, reported hearing it moving, a heavy, irregular, flapping, bumping movement, coming down through the body of the church, through the nave, toward the front doors. Someone near the church swore the outer doors had rattled from the inside. Then the lights had come back on, and whatever had been at the door had gone back up. The reporters who went to the church the next morning found the interior disturbed, cushions torn, pew linings scattered, a bad smell throughout the building. In the tower, every lancet window had been broken, and 2 of them had been hastily stuffed with torn fabric, as if something had been trying, in the dark, to restore the absolute blackness of the tower, to prevent the returning light from driving it back. Blake read the newspaper account and did not put it down for a long time. There was a detail that the reporters, focused on the sensational aspects of the story, had apparently not thought worth mentioning in much detail. The metal box with the stone and the reporter's skeleton from 1893 were no longer in the tower. They were gone. Whether they had been moved by whatever lived in the steeple, or removed by some of the local residents who had finally worked up the nerve to go inside, Blake could not determine. But the stone was somewhere in the dark now, uncontained, and the thing that had used it as a window into the world was stronger than it had been when he first visited. He could feel it, in the way a compass needle feels the pull of magnetic north, not a thought, not an emotion, but a physical sensation, a directional pull in the tissue of his mind. He could feel it, 2 miles away across the rooftops, watching him. July 30th, Blake's diary records, in careful and clearly frightened handwriting, the experience that broke him. He had gone to bed at his usual time. He had, in recent weeks, begun tying his ankles to the bedpost before sleeping. Not, he told visitors who noticed the ropes, because he was afraid, but because he had developed a habit of sleepwalking that he wanted to prevent from becoming a problem. This was only partly true. He was afraid. He was more afraid than he had ever been in his life. And on the night of July 30th, the ropes were not enough. He woke, or something that felt like waking, in darkness. Not the familiar darkness of his bedroom, a different darkness, close, cold, smelling of something he could not name, organic and old and wrong. He was standing up. Around him, he could make out thin horizontal bars of faint blue light. He was moving, or rather his body was moving, in the careful way of someone navigating a space they know well, in a dark they are accustomed to. His hands found a stone pillar with a hollow top. His feet found the bottom rung of a ladder. He was in the tower of the church. He was climbing. The smell intensified as he rose toward the trap door. A heat beat down at him from above, and with it a sense of something vast and awake and utterly without mercy. He could see, behind his eyes, images he could not account for, worlds he had never imagined, spaces between galaxies, a darkness that was not empty, but dense with a consciousness so alien that the word consciousness barely applied to it. And then a sharp, explosive crack of sound from outside, a firecracker from the summer celebrations on the hill, split the moment in two, and Robert Blake fell off the ladder. He scrambled down the spiral stairs, through the nave, through the cellar, out into the night air of Federal Hill, and ran. He ran 2 miles through the dark streets of Providence. He ran up College Hill to his own door. He collapsed in his study. When he woke on the floor the next morning, his clothes were dirty and torn. His hair was singed at the edges. His body smelled, faintly but unmistakably, of the same wrong organic smell that had been in the tower. He did not leave his apartment for the next 10 days. He ordered all his food by telephone. He spoke to no one. He sat at his desk and stared west toward Federal Hill and wrote in his diary in large, shaky letters and tied his ankles to his bed every night with knots that he tightened until they left marks on his skin. He telephoned the electric company 3 separate times, begging them to take extra precautions against power outages. They were polite with him. They thought he was eccentric. They did not take him seriously. And then the storm came, August 8. The great storm broke just before midnight. It came in from the Atlantic, with the force of something that had been building for days over open water. Enormous, black, electric, dropping sheets of rain that turned the streets of Providence into running rivers. Lightning struck repeatedly across the city. 2 fireballs were reported by witnesses who saw them from their windows and could not explain them afterward. The thunder was continuous, not individual cracks, but a rolling, overlapping cannonade that shook windows and kept the whole city awake. Blake was at his desk from the beginning of it. He had to keep his apartment dark in order to see out the window. Even his desk lamp would have reflected in the glass and blotted out his view of the city. So he sat in the dark, at his desk, watching the constellation of streetlights on Federal Hill 2 miles away, and wrote in his diary by feel, the pencil moving across the paper in the dark, the words going where they went without his eyes to guide them. The entries from this period are irregular. Some words are missing. Some lines trail off into nothing. But the sequence is clear enough. The lights were on. Then they were flickering. Then at 2:12 in the morning, they went out entirely. Blake wrote 2 words in the dark, lights out, and then, God help me. On Federal Hill, there were watchers. The residents of the streets nearest the old church had been awake since the storm began, and as the lightning flashed, they gathered in the square before the church's facade, men and women holding candles in cupped hands, umbrellas against the rain, crucifixes and small charms from a dozen different Italian traditions. Someone had roused a priest from the nearest Catholic church, and he was there in the square, praying in Latin, his vestments soaked through, his voice barely audible above the thunder. They watched the dark steeple. They blessed every lightning flash that lit it up. They prayed that the storm would not outlast their candles. The wind rose and blew most of the candles out. The darkness thickened around the church, and then, at 2:35 in the morning, with Father Antonio Marusso's watch open in his hand, and Patrolman William Monaghan at his side, it happened. The wooden louver boards on the east window of the tower burst outward and fell into the churchyard below. A smell hit the crowd in the square like a physical force, something between decay and electricity, and something else entirely that had no name in any language these people spoke. The air shook with a vibration, not quite a sound, more like a pressure change, like the moment before a very large thing moves. The candles that remained guttered and went out together. The rain fell in a new direction, suddenly blown east by a wind that had not been there a moment before. And in the total darkness above the church, several of the watchers thought they saw something. Not clearly, not in any way they could describe precisely afterward. A mass, a movement, something large and dark and purposeful, rising from the tower and moving east across the sky with a speed that weather does not move, moving toward College Hill, moving toward the house where Robert Blake sat at his desk in the dark. The final entries in Blake's diary are dated August 8th and written in the dark. The handwriting becomes increasingly difficult to read as the pages go on, the letters growing, then shrinking, then sprawling across the page at angles that suggest a man writing without being able to see what he is writing. Some entries are separated by gaps of what feel like minutes. Others run together. The pencil pressure varies wildly, sometimes barely marking the page, sometimes pressing through it. The sequence is fragmentary, but unmistakable. Lights still out. Must be 5 minutes now. Everything depends on lightning. The thing is taking hold of my mind. Trouble with memory. I see things I never knew before. Other worlds, other galaxies. Dark. The lightning seems dark, and the darkness seems light. It cannot be the real hill and church that I see in the pitch darkness. Must be retinal impression left by flashes. Heaven grant the Italians are out with their candles if the lightning stops. What am I afraid of? I remember other worlds and more distant places and the ultimate void of the black planets. The long winging flight through the void. My name is Blake, Robert Harrison Blake of 620 Eastern Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am on this planet. Have mercy. The lightning no longer flashes. Horrible. I can see everything with a monstrous sense that is not sight. Light is dark, and dark is light. Those people on the hill guard their candles and their charms. No light, no glass, can hear. I am mad, or going mad. The thing is stirring and fumbling in the tower. I am it, and it is I. I want to get out, must get out, and unify the forces. It knows where I am. I am Robert Blake, but I see the tower in the dark. There is a monstrous odor, senses changed entirely. The boarding at that tower window cracking and giving way. I see it coming here. Hell wind, Titan blur, black wings. Save me. The three-lobed burning eye. These are the last words in the diary. Students in a fraternity house whose upper rear windows faced Blake's study noticed his pale face at the westward window on the morning of August 9th and assumed he was working. They saw the same face in the same position that evening and began to worry. They rang the bell of the darkened apartment and got no answer. They called a policeman. The door was forced. Robert Blake was at his desk, upright, his right hand still wrapped around the pencil, his eyes open, glassy and bulging, his face fixed in an expression of such extreme and total terror that the first officers through the door turned away from it. The window he faced was unbroken. The coroner examined the body and reported death by electrical shock, or by severe nervous trauma resulting from electrical discharge nearby. The terrible expression on his face he attributed to the psychological effects of such a shock on a person of abnormal imagination and overstimulated nerves. He noted the manuscripts, the paintings, the diary, and drew his conclusions. He signed the death certificate. He closed the case. The window was unbroken. Blake's diary told a different story. There was a physician in Providence at this time, a reputable man, well-educated, known to have an interest in local folklore and the history of unusual religious organizations, who read the newspaper accounts of Robert Blake's death with more care than most. He had known something about the Starry Wisdom sect for years. He had been waiting for something like this, in the way that people who understand a particular danger wait, not hoping for it, but not surprised when it arrives. After Blake's death, this man obtained, through means that were never entirely made clear in any official record, the metal box and the red-black stone that had been recovered from the church on Federal Hill. He carried them to the waterfront. He hired a boat. He went out to the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay, and he threw them in. The stone glowed, witnesses reported, as it hit the water, a cold red-black light, visible briefly beneath the surface, and then gone. The doctor was widely criticized by the academic community for the destruction of what might have been a significant archaeological object, by the city for taking unilateral action on property that was, technically, still attached to the old church estate, by various interested parties who had wanted to examine the stone more carefully before any decision was made about its disposition. He listened to all of this criticism with the patience of a man who has done what he knows needed doing and has made his peace with the consequences. He said only this, that the stone had been self-luminous, even in total darkness, and that self-luminous stones do not occur in nature. that whatever was capable of moving through the darkness of the windowless steeple toward a lit window 2 miles away was not something that belonged in any collection, that the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay was a better resting place for the Shining Trapezahedron than any museum or university vault or private safe, because any of those places could be opened in the dark. The bay could not. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the stone is still there, deep in the mud and cold water of the bay, its alien facets catching no light, because there is none to catch. Perhaps whatever moved through the dark toward Robert Blake's window on the night of August 8, 1935, has returned to wherever it came from, held in check by the absolute absence of eyes to look through. Perhaps the connection it made through the stone, through those terrible, willing, curious eyes, is finally and permanently severed now that the stone is gone. Perhaps. But the bay is very dark at the bottom, and dark, as Robert Blake discovered too late, is all it needs.